Hello guys and welcome back. For today's project we will conquer the high seas. Aircraft carrier IJN Taiho from Tamiya in 1:700 scale is ready for deployment. The kit is from Tamiya's waterline series, meaning it has a flat bottom and nothing of the ship that would be beneath the waterline is included. Some ship modelers hate it, others like it, and it really depends on the kind of models you want to build. These kits all include a few metal blocks to add some weight. I incorporate them accordingly in this case, but since the model will end up on a diorama base, I could have easily skipped this step. And the construction of this kit is actually not that complicated, since we don't even have that many parts. The first reason for this is that this kit was released in 1972 and is therefore simply not as detailed as one would expect from a new kit. And the second reason is that there simply aren't that many parts on an aircraft carrier in general. The only things that are actually attached to the ship's hull are the platforms for the anti-aircraft guns and a small deck for the lifeboats. I'm leaving all the guns separate from the ship on their runners, as it's easier to paint them that way and I don't risk accidentally breaking anything. There's no way to build a hangar inside the ship. The flight deck is also relatively unspectacular, as apart from a few searchlights there is only the really small superstructure with the conning tower and the large funnel, as well as a few masts. At least these parts are relatively nice detailed. If you want to attach the searchlights, you have to drill a few holes before attaching the flight deck. And that's essentially all the construction of the ship. As I said, there wasn't much to do and it was completed in an afternoon without any problems. And after building comes painting. I begin with a layer of black primer, this time from AK Interactive. The airbrush I will be using in this video is the GHAD 39 Advanced series, which Gaahleri kindly provided me for free. The airbrush comes with both a 0.35 and a 0.5mm nozzle. For a larger surface like here, I have the 0.5mm nozzle installed. I prime everything, including all the extras and planes I have kept separate for now. For my next step, I will deviate from the historically accurate data I know about the Taiho. This armored aircraft carrier was actually almost entirely grey. However, that seems a bit boring to me, as the model itself already has very few details. Therefore, I will take some artistic freedom and use my own camouflage scheme, inspired by the camouflages from the game World of Warships. The first layer for this is a light green that I apply over the entire ship, again with the 0.5mm nozzle. I use the airbrush with about 2 bars of air pressure, which, with appropriately well diluted paint, results in an even and clean application of paint. Next, I need some masking tape to apply the subsequent colors. I let the previous color dry thoroughly first to avoid damage from the masking tape. And this is the finished masking. I opted for a mix of sharp and straight lines with a few soft curves using masking putty. The next color is a slightly darker shade of green. For this, I swapped the 0.5mm nozzle for the 0.35mm nozzle. This works incredibly easy with this airbrush as it doesn't even require a wrench and the nozzle is self-centering, with no error-prone thread. When spraying mask areas, it is important to apply the paint not too thickly, so it doesn't accidentally run under the masking tape. Therefore, I apply my paint in many, very thin layers to achieve a clean finish. Once the paint is dry, I can carefully remove the masking tape. If you've done a good job beforehand, this is always a very satisfying step. The first secondary color for the deck is finished, but I'd like to make the camouflage pattern a bit more interesting. So I applied more masking tape, this time in a slightly smaller, more specific pattern that will hopefully show up well in the end. And I chose an even darker shade of green for this color. Same procedure as before. Apply the paint in thin layers, making sure the paint doesn't pool at the edges of the tape. I could certainly cover the ship's hull with masking tape or putty and then spray it, but I'm a bit tired of using an airbrush right now, so I will use a good old brush and paint the pattern by hand. Even if you have an airbrush, it's a good idea to occasionally cover larger areas with a brush to maintain practice. It's a bit more tedious, but you can also apply clean and even camouflage with a regular brush. The consistency of the paint is particularly important. If the paint is too thick, the brush strokes will remain visible and the result will look very unrealistic, especially at this scale. Instead, the paint needs to be very thin so that all the brush strokes can even out before the paint starts to dry. This will look very strange and wrong in the first few layers, and the whole process will take several layers to look good. After about 4 or 5 layers, depending on the quality of your paint, the layers will begin to develop full opacity without any visible brush strokes. It is also very important that the paint is not too thin like gouache, otherwise the paint will start to flow around the details and into the recesses all by itself. It's also important to let each layer dry completely between coats. If you don't, you will just start wiping off the previous layer of paint, which can quickly lead to a disaster. I don't like the transition here where I used the masking putty, so I'm going to paint a few light green lines here, which will also create a bit more contrast. The Yamato from World of Warships has a wave in its bow camouflage that I really like, so I'm going to paint a similar wave on my aircraft carrier. I will also paint a similar wave on the stern. In reality, such fake waves were actually seen on some ships. The idea was to make it more difficult for enemy observers to estimate the ship's speed. At a time when ships could be observed almost exclusively by visual contact, this may well have had a positive effect. The ship is currently quite green, even with the different tones. so I'm going to paint the Japanese flag on the flight deck. The airbrush is better for this, as applying white paint with a brush is really tedious. For the red circle, I first used a circle stencil, but unfortunately this resulted in a lot of overspray, so I created another circle mask afterwards to correct the mistakes. I select a few details on the flight deck to paint grey. This adds a bit more variation and breaks up the large surfaces. Now I can also attach all the separately painted secondary guns and anti-aircraft weapons with superglue. The amount of weathering on a ship is significantly less than what we could do on a tank model. I start with a simple wash on the entire flight deck. Beforehand, I sprayed everything with a coat of glossy clear varnish to protect the acrylic paints from the weathering products. I apply the wash quite heavily to highlight the few details. There aren't many details, so we have to do our best to bring out the ones that are here. Since I have a glossy surface, I can let the wash dry before cleaning up any imperfections and unsightly spots. To do this, I simply use some white spirit and brush. I imagine the flight deck would get pretty dirty quickly during extended missions, from exhaust fumes, smoke, fuel and the like. Therefore, I will use a brush and a toothpick to apply some small splatters all over the deck to create small spots. For this, I use engine oil from AK Interactive. This product stays glossy after drying to give it a fresh and realistic look. If any spots get too large, I can easily remove or blend them with white spirit. I would also like to add a few streaking effects to the hull of the ship. For this, I use the previous dark brown wash and a white wash, which represents salt residue from the seawater. I apply both colors in vertical lines across the entire hull. I can apply a lot of paint here, most of it will be removed later, so don't worry, it won't look like this forever. I will let the effects dry now a bit before I can continue. Now I take a flat weathering brush, which I have previously moistened with white spirit. I now blend the streaks from top to bottom with the brush. This leaves only very fine lines visible at the end, which then perfectly represent grime running down. Depending on how strong I want this effect, I can stop earlier or later, or simply add more stripes to repeat the process. And if I don't like the effect in some places, that's not a problem, because I can simply clean everything with a bit of white spirit and start over. That's why it is so important to me to protect my successful effects and colors with clear varnish, so that I have a little bit more flexibility with the subsequent effects. The final weathering effects are a few streaks on the flight deck. I imagine that the constant landing and takeoff of aircraft would definitely leave tire marks and dirt. I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did before, except the stripes are horizontal now and I'm leaving out the white. So that's enough effects for the ship for now. Let's take a quick look at the planes. I don't know what planes are included in this kit, as the instructions don't tell you. Therefore, when painting them, I will only be able to reproduce the approximate look of the Japanese aircraft. So please forgive me if the aircraft don't look 100% as they should. Unfortunately, my camera had a lot of trouble capturing the work in the Airbrush booth, so here's a brief summary. First, all aircraft were primed with black, before I painted the undersides with deck tan. I also picked out 4 fighter aircraft that I will paint completely in this color, because somehow the A6M0 always comes to mind first in the lighter paint scheme for me. Then I mixed a shade of green that looked roughly like the green of the Japanese planes to paint the tops of the remaining planes. For identification purposes, many Japanese aircraft had yellow stripes on the front of their wings. I'm quite limited in terms of detail at this scale, but with some precision I can paint the stripes on all aircraft. I can also paint the cockpit black to make it stand out from the rest. I think such small details are very important, as they significantly enhance the small models and make them look more realistic. And Tamiya kindly included small decals for the red circles, so I don't have to paint them crookedly by hand. And yes, I know most aircraft actually had at least 6 circles, 2 under the wings, 2 on top of the wings, and 1 on the right and left behind the cockpit. But I'm only going to put the 2 on top of the wings, since the area behind the cockpit is far too small and you can't see under the aircraft anyways. Besides, there aren't even enough decals to apply seeks to each aircraft. Unfortunately, no propellers are included, which is a real shame, but to be expected given the age of the kit. I had previously built propellers myself in this scale, until I realized that the Japanese airplanes use 3 rotor blades instead of 4, which ended my attempt to upgrade them prematurely. Maybe with propellers next time. Finally for the planes, a quick black wash to highlight the panel lines a bit more. And then we can put the model parts aside for a bit. As you probably saw on the thumbnail, this carrier will swim in the ocean. The base for my ocean is a piece of MDF board cut to size with a piece of styrofoam on top. First, I have to choose a suitable position for the aircraft carrier and mark it on the styrofoam. Being a waterline kit has both advantages and disadvantages here. On the one hand, I can simply glue the model flat to the surface, but on the other hand, I have to be careful not to make the waves too deep, otherwise it will be obvious that the ship is missing its underside. Then I will mark the waves on the foam to get a rough idea. In addition to the waves generated by the ship itself, I will also make some normal ocean waves that the ship moves through. To recreate the larger waves, I will be using air dry clay from the hobby store. The one I have left is already a bit older, but with some tap water I can reactivate it for this purpose. I roll the clay into a few thin strings of the appropriate length and place them on the previously marked spots. With my finger, I press the clay firmly onto the styrofoam and smooth the transition. I let the waves taper off a bit towards the center. The clay may have some trouble sticking to the styrofoam at first, but with a little water I can make it stickier. For now, all I care about is making sure the waves are smooth and the shape is right. I will add the texture later. To adhere everything even more firmly, I'm using PVA glue. Since my hands are already dirty from all the clay, I can just spread the glue over with my finger. That means one less brush to clean up. I will let the whole thing dry, After that I have a solid base to continue working on. For the rest of the water surface, I will use some aluminium foil. I will tear a suitable piece off the roll and crumble it a bit. But not too much, because we don't want too many small wrinkles. Then I spread more PVA glue over the entire styrofoam. This glue really is best for this purpose, because it won't accidentally dissolve the foam. Now I can carefully glue my crumbled and unfolded aluminium foil in place. When pressing firmly, I will have to be careful not to accidentally smooth out the wrinkles. Therefore, I press the foil very gently to maintain the texture. I will also remove the foil from the clay waves, as I don't want the same wave texture here as in the areas without larger waves. To do this, I carefully cut them free with a scalpel and use a little more glue for the transition. Now I have to prime the base. For that I mix some PVA glue, black acrylic paint and water. Then I spread this mixture in several layers over the entire diorama. This allows me to make the surface a bit more resistant and the subsequent paints adhere better to the surface. I now let the layer dry completely for at least 24 hours. Next, I spray another coat of regular primer as the base for my final colors. Perhaps I could skip this step, but I want to make sure the colors adhere properly. For the watercolor, I use sea blue. I think I also used this color for my submarine diorama and I really liked it there. I spray the paint over the entire water surface, trying to achieve a uniform finish. For this job, I will again install the larger 0.5mm nozzle. To achieve good opacity, I need a total of 3 to 4 coats, which I let dry briefly in between. I will lighten the water around the ship a bit. This shade is also called sea blue, but it's from a different manufacturer and therefore a completely different shade of course. The water around the ship appears brighter because it's swirled around and traps air. And then I sprayed the entire surface with a heavy coat of high gloss clear varnish. This is very important as the surface absolutely needs to shine to achieve a realistic wet effect. Next, I need to add the wave foam that would form around the ship. The basis for this is simple cotton wool. I pull some cotton apart to create small strands. I will now attach these to my waves using diluted PVA glue. Once the beginning sticks, the rest can easily be pressed on with a brush and shaped into the desired shape. However, I will only apply this effect to the waves created by the ship. The foam only appears when the waves break, and normal waves on the open sea don't usually break until they reach the beach or a sandbank. Working with cotton wool is a bit fiddly. The cotton wool quickly looks fuzzy if you don't glue it down properly, so I soak everything in a good amount of glue to make it as smooth as possible. Once everything is dry, I can rub off some of the loose fuzz with my finger and smooth the surface. If I stretch the cotton a little, I can also create larger swirling areas like behind the stern of the ship. And this is what it looks like after the glue has dried. The white effect is less noticeable as all the white glue has dried transparently. But that's not a problem, that was just the first step. For the additional effects, it's better if the aircraft carrier is on the diorama. I use PVA glue here again to adhere it. It's better to use a little bit more than too little. The underside of the ship should have plenty of contact and the gap between the diorama and the ship should be relatively small. To close the unavoidable small gap, I again used cotton wool, which I've rolled into a small roll. Since the cotton wool has a nice volume, even larger gaps can easily be concealed. I'm now doing this all the way around the ship. At the front of the bow, I also tried to shape the cotton wool a bit like a bow wave. Since the cotton wool didn't have much opacity, I'm now using a foam effect from Vallejo. That's basically just white paint, but a bit thicker and with a very high opacity. First, I apply this effect to the cotton wool to make the foam stand out a bit more. By dabbing the brush, I can create very realistic looking transitions between the foam and the water. On such a large diorama, I can experiment a bit to find out what works best and learn techniques for future dioramas. After taking a closer look at my water surface, I have to say I'm not entirely satisfied. It somehow doesn't have the right texture yet. I still have this sea effect from Ammo by Mick, a blue paste that turns translucent blue after it dries. After testing it on a corner, I apply the texture to the entire water. I will use a flat brush for this. Depending on whether I brush, stipple or smudge the paste, different effects emerge. This adds a bit more detail to my surface and hopefully makes the water look more realistic. This paste is also great for the transition between foam and water. If I apply a very thin layer at the transition zone, it looks as if the swirls are deeper in the water. Until everything dries, the diorama will look very odd. But once it's completely dry, we will have a nice effect on the water surface, which looks much better than before. Next, I need another very small brush. I will use this to paint the fine small waves. It's good to find some references, both in real images and other models. This makes it easier to learn how and where the ship creates waves and what they would look like. I usually use a sponge for chipping effects, but we can put it to good use here too. I put on some paint on the sponge and stipple it all around the ship. This creates a smoother and better transition, and the little dots are simply a nice detail that enhances the entire surface. Now I can attach the missing details like the searchlights, the crane and the masts. I use super glue for this. But what would be an aircraft carrier without aircraft? I can finally stick all the flight squadrons onto the deck. I'm grouping the aircraft here by type. The torpedo bombers are at the back. In the middle we have what I assume are dive bombers. And at the very front, ready to take off, are the fighters. 2 fighter planes are still waiting at the back and are currently being taken out of the hangar. 2 of the included aircraft look different from the rest, and honestly I have no idea what those aircraft are. Maybe they are reconnaissance aircraft or messenger planes. Either way, I'm putting them at the very back of the flight deck. I also got a little extra for this model. Photo-etched figures in 1:700 scale. I've never worked with such small figures before, but I thought they would add a nice level of detail to the model. I simply glue them in place with super glue, which is very annoying to film, so I will just show you the result with the finished figures. I like it, even though there probably need to be a lot more figures. Finally, I paint the wooden frame black and stick on the nameplate, and we are ready to see the final result. I had a lot of fun building something different. Ship dioramas are so different from tank models, and if you do it right, you can make the whole thing look so realistic. I still need some practice for that, but you have to start somewhere, right? I have few other aircraft carriers, including modern ones, on my shelf just waiting to be built. So if you'd like to see more ship dioramas, let me know in the comments. I hope you also had some fun with this little project, and maybe could even learn something together with me. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.